Thank you very much, Rebecca. It's great to be here. Thank you all for joining, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. We do have a great session here focused on best practices for modern records management and retention. We'll talk a lot about some of the challenges that people have had over the years dealing with records management and retention. Talk a little bit about the emergence of content services and how that changes the equation. And we'll give you some great recommendations on how you can bring better records management, retention policies, and general information governance to your organization as well. So let's get started. The first thing we want to do is just kind of talk a little bit about information and when and why it's at risk. And what we've really found through my career, obviously, and then obviously here at Nuxio as well, is that information that you have within your organization is at risk a lot of the time. It's certainly at risk until it is digitized. If you're still storing your content in file cabinets or on file shares, potentially even, that information is not very well managed, and it certainly is at risk to any number of catastrophes, whether that's just being lost, whether it's a fire, whether it's a flood. We've got a lot of anecdotes to share about companies that have run into issues just because they haven't digitized their content and gotten it into electronic form. It's also an issue that information is at risk if it's not under control. So if it is left out on file shares, if it's stored on your local hard drive, if it's stored in other systems that aren't really looking out for that information, that information's at risk. And if you have any legal obligations for that content to be retained, to be prevented from being modified as a record, then you've got some serious concerns about whether that information is secure or whether it's at risk. You want to be able to put that information in motion. These two things are not at odds with one another. You can have information very much under control, but still be able to use it as part of your business processes, as being able to use that information to help drive important business decisions. And ultimately, what you're trying to accomplish is to be able to leverage that information for as much value as possible. And certainly, having good records management allows you to make sure you have that information secure, make sure you know where that information is, and using many of the tools that we'll talk about during this session is going to allow you to leverage it for a greater value. So let's get into it. So what's the problem here? It's the reality is that ECM, content management, has been around for at least a couple decades now, but we still see a lot of the same challenges. Nothing has really changed for most ECM users. We look at legacy ECM solutions and we find that they certainly do an excellent job at organizing and helping you to manage your information. It certainly provides a secure repository for you to keep your content stored. It can offer certainly a lot of the value that we're looking for around records management retention in terms of being able to hold on to that information and make sure it's not modified, make sure it's not deleted, make sure you can find it if you have some type of a legal discovery that requires that you be able to access that information quickly. But we see a lot of challenges, and certainly one of the last piece of that prior slide was that we wanted to get the most value out of the information. And what we find is that ECM does an okay job at being able to help automate processes that depend upon that important content, and it does an okay job at being able to deliver new insights into that content. And a lot of that depends on how you're using the system, how your solution's been set up. But one of the big challenges that we know a lot of companies struggle with is how to get to the cloud and how to be able to adjust some of the cost factors associated with maintaining ECM solutions to a more cost-effective way of operating on the web. And there certainly are some issues there, both in terms of actually getting there and whether or not that's really going to be a cost-effective move to make. We see a number of other challenges with ECM as well. I think we find that that you can see here that one of the big issues we have over on the right is that people have a hard time finding information in legacy ECM solutions. In part, that's because the tool sets just aren't good enough, and in part, it's because of the bottom right statistic here is that companies have an average of 9 different solutions within their enterprises for managing content, things that they classify as enterprise content management. So it makes it very difficult for you to have any one system then be able to manage all that information. The systems aren't very well connected with one another. In fact, we find that 8 of 10 organizations say their systems are not fully integrated in the ways that they really want to be able to leverage them. And you can see that, but you can see here that, especially if we go up to the top right now, or top left now rather, the AI is certainly a really interesting technology, and we'll talk about how it's relevant for records management and retention. These things don't necessarily feel like they're closely related, but I'm going to talk to you about why AI really is important. And you can see here that while it's very attractive for organizations, most don't think they have the skills or the tools that are available to be able to tackle this type of technology. Now, one of the big issues I talked about was the number of silos or the number of systems that organizations have within their organizations. And I think this is one of the big areas that I'm going to give you from a best practices perspective that you need to focus on, is around getting control over these silos, because it really does then tie into your ability to apply good information governance to all the content within your organization. It's not just about what you're controlling within one system, it's about being able to get control over the enterprise. And I think the statistics clearly show, and I'm sure your experience shows, that you have more than one information silo within your organization. And what we find increasingly is that part of that's driven by users themselves. People are going to continue to use the apps and the services that make them more productive. And we see that in a couple of different areas. Certainly, like SharePoint usage. SharePoint is very popular in part because it's very easy to use. It's integrated directly into Office. It's very easy to collaborate with your colleagues or with people outside your organization using SharePoint and some of the cloud services that they provide. Another big area of concern is around enterprise file sync and share solutions, things like Box or Dropbox that are really contributing to information being able to exist in an organization, but outside of controls that allow you to keep track of that information, apply good records management and retention policies to it. So we'll talk a little bit about how you can bridge that gap. The other big area that we see, especially over the past several years, is that companies want to be able to integrate content services into their existing business applications. So things like Salesforce or ERP systems or digital asset management systems, be able to integrate content management services that are provided by Nuxio or anybody else into those important business processes, so that users can get access to that content directly within the context that they're used to working in, and also a context that has those documents directly related to the job they're doing on a daily basis. There's some real important capabilities in modern content management capabilities to be able to federate all these multiple data sources together and be able to provide control over all that information, whether or not it's stored within one repository or another. So we do think it's time for a new approach, and we think it's time to look at more modern content services solutions to be able to get that control of your information, be able to provide the capabilities so that you can extract as much value as possible from your information. But it's important to define the principles that are important to you. I think, I'm just going to really quickly go through this, but, information, wherever it exists, is a corporate asset, and it really should be managed. And that's, not just the information that you have strict processes around to store within your dedicated business systems or content management systems. It really is everything. And I think it requires that understanding that information exists in multiple contexts. So, and that's not to say the same as saying it exists in multiple silos. It's saying that context for that information, what's relevant to, what business processes it's relevant to, what information governance principles it's important to. You need to make sure you're understanding that, so that you're understanding both how that information is being used and also what the governance requirements are for it. Information isn't created in a vacuum. It has purpose. It's part of a process. It's part of a documentation of information that you need to maintain. So understanding what that purpose is certainly has a direct impact on how you decide to manage it. Whether or not you assign security controls to it, whether or not you apply retention policies or records management capabilities to it. And they really need to be accountable to that information. You need to make sure that you have governance capabilities in in your organization such that you're accountable for managing that information correctly. Understand also who the stakeholders are, and they might not all be within your organization. There may be partners that you're working with, other collaborations that you're working on, or potentially your customers that have information and they're as much a stakeholder in that information as you are, and they're relying in many cases on you being accountable for that information, so that if there is some type of a legal discovery that takes place, that you are, following good information governance, have that information as stored as a record with retention policies, so that information is available. All information has value, but that information does change through a life cycle. So some information is extremely important today. Other information, as you can see in the next point, has a shelf life, has an importance over several years and maybe longer. So make sure that you have policies in place to make sure that they can they're paying attention to that very important fact. It's also important to understand that information has many forms. So some information might be available in Office documents. We see a lot of that, obviously. PDF files, obviously, is another example, but we're increasingly seeing that information that is in specialty formats, maybe like a CAD drawing, for example, or graphic formats, photographs or schematics may be important. Also, multimedia files, whether that's audio or video files, are increasingly becoming a part of the content that we are seeing in the business context. So these are not just for graphic design. These are actually important tools that have many that have real value within the context of a business process. Think, for example, about an insurance company that is working on claims processing. Having the ability to get photographs from the accident scene, for example, or a video that shows that it's what's happening from multiple angles is extremely valuable and is increasingly prevalent in the insurance industry. And there's examples of that across many different vertical markets. Information has obligations, and again, that's important, and I'm going to talk a lot about how you can automate the ability to make sure that you're adhering to these obligations in real time. And the risk associated with not maintaining control of that information, obviously, is pretty significant. So let's talk a little bit about what modern content requirements are and how they differ from some of the legacy challenges that we've seen. So modern content requirements, we want to support digital form factors. We talked about that, multimedia formats. We need to be able to bridge information silos, be able to bring all the information we have throughout the enterprise together in a single way of managing it. You want to be able to deliver insight and intelligence to that information. So that's being able to extract relevant information about those documents. So if you're looking for something that's descriptive about a certain business process, you can search for information and apply those different attributes to the search so that you're able to actually narrow down and find exactly what you're looking for. Embrace these new content types. It's only going to grow from here, and we think that this is an important change that's happening in recent years, where companies are increasingly seeing that multimedia formats and specialty formats have a direct role in the compliance and the governance that they have within the organization. You want to ensure security and good governance around information. Obviously, we're going to talk about that much more as we go through this. Cloud acceleration, cloud adoption acceleration is certainly something that we see where organizations are looking for ways to be able to take advantage of the scalability of the cloud, the cost constraints around the cloud, and also the agility that you can achieve in the cloud. So that's an important part. We see large organizations that are scaling up their operations. We've heard for over the past decade or more that content is doubling year over year, and we're certainly seeing that, and it's growing beyond just twice as many Office documents. We're seeing a growth in the types of documents, and that again complicates things, but certainly is an important requirement to list here. And then I think the final point is a really important one. You want to make sure it's easy to use. One of the challenges we see with legacy ECM is the difficulty of being able to use some of the solutions that are created, or be able to make adjustments to those solutions. So being able to have flexibility and agility in the way that you're deploying your applications, the way you're presenting the user experiences to your end users is extremely important. So let's talk about some of the challenges that ECM has had over the years. I think one is certainly that they're very focused on the information that is within the system. So there's single repository solutions. They're really managing all the content that they're storing within their system, not as concerned about the rest of the information that exists throughout your enterprise. They're also providing a suite of solutions or a suite rather, of all the different technologies that can make up ECM. And while that has some advantages, those are all work well together, it's certainly limiting from a deployment perspective. You don't have the ability to pick and choose the right technologies to put your solution together, to have a solution that works well for you. There's some advantages in terms of being able to deal with a single vendor, have well integrated solutions that are part of that suite. But if you need to get outside of that, things get a lot more difficult. Pre-cloud architectures, in many of these cases, these legacy ECM solutions allow you to deploy their solutions on the cloud, and that can be very useful, but they're not doing it in a way that really is optimal for a cloud deployment. They're often scaled up to your maximum requirements, so the cost of deploying into the cloud is not necessarily as economical as you'd want it to be, and they also are not as easy to make adjustments. So if you need to add capabilities, if you need to scale up or scale down in some way, those all require redeployment, and that can be a very difficult process, and certainly one that has a cost factor associated with it in terms of downtime, in terms of IT costs, and so forth. There's lots of difficulties in terms of development. These while these ECM suites certainly have the ability to extend and customize their solutions, they aren't necessarily low code. They aren't necessarily done in a way that allow business analysts to be able to go in and make choices. It requires a lot of help from your IT or development organizations, or from partners that you're using to help deploy your solutions. Ultimately, these solutions become costly. They become very expensive to own, to maintain, and to operate over time. Now, content services offers a real promise. So content services is a series of microservices that can be used to create content services solutions, but it has a broader approach to it. So certainly one aspect is it's multi-repository. We can federate different systems within your organization to be able to provide content services across that content, even if it's not stored in the repository that the content services solution provides. It's a singular platform that is inclusive of all the capabilities, complete with APIs, so you have the ability to tie things together in very, very defined ways. Most content service solutions are native to the cloud, so you have the ability to take advantage of the cloud in terms of scaling up or scaling down specific services as you need them. If you need more compute power, you can adjust that without having to adjust the size of the repository or the storage that you're using, or vice versa, depending upon what you need. So you have a lot more scalability because it's based on the cloud. You also have the ability, because we're using a microservices architecture, really taking advantage of some of the deployment advantages that you have over the cloud. You see a lot of new solutions, including Nuxios, that are really focused on low-code tooling, making it easy for business analysts or even a citizen developer to be able to go in and make changes, whether that's adding new capabilities, making adjustments due to changing business conditions. You really have the ability to be much more agile in the way that you're deploying your solutions, instead of being very, kind of waterfall approach as most content management systems platforms do today. And cloud consumption pricing, I think, is extremely important. You really have the ability to optimize your spend on the cloud in a much more effective way. So you can see there's some real advantages as we move from legacy ECM to content services in terms of addressing some of the key challenges that we've seen over the years with legacy ECM solution. So really the rise of modern cloud native content services platforms offers this new approach, and it's both for managing content, but also with managing records and being able to take care of that important records content that you have within your organization. Intelligent content starts with data, and what is data? Data is really what you're really managing here is information. You want to manage the data, but you also need to manage the content itself. So focus on the information, because that is really what you're ultimately looking to do. You want to make sure that information is readily available. You need to make sure it's contextual, that you have enough information about that document that you know what that document is and you know how to find it, or it shows up in your search queries appropriately. You want it to be available anywhere, and certainly the cloud has a huge role there in terms of providing ubiquitous access, whether it's through desktop computers within your enterprise network or whether it's on your mobile device on the road. Being able to get to that content becomes extremely important. But you also want to make sure that you have strong governance and security around that document so that you're confident that information is the information you need to see, and it's also going to be there if you need to have backup later on to the decisions you're making based on that. Stepping back and looking at, what kind of architecture you're looking for here, you want to have content services platform that provide all the key capabilities that you need, whether it's case management capabilities, content delivery, search capabilities, the ability to apply security and audit controls to your information, strong data models that allow you to build a system that has all the information you need to. But you also have a lot of flexibility in terms of how you can deploy that solution, either on a public cloud infrastructure, on your own cloud infrastructure, on the vendor's cloud infrastructure. So lots of options there. And you want to make sure that you have different tiers of storage as well, so that you can take advantage of S3 storage for very quick access, and again, to deliver on that promise of ubiquity to the end users. But you also want to make sure you have archive or less costly data tiers, so that you can move content to lower cost storage over time if that information doesn't need to be accessed instantaneously. And then obviously you can build in any number of solutions on top of that, either to address specific business problems, to integrate with other enterprise applications you're using today, and so forth. All right, so before we start talking a little bit more about what technologies and what the best practices are for doing this, I think there are some really good governance requirements here that are important to set here. So the first one is really to embrace digitization. If you don't have information digitized, it becomes extremely difficult to apply any level of good governance to it. You can certainly do it the way we did it 20 years ago, but really digitization offers just dramatic improvements in terms of the flexibility you have, the amount of automation you can apply to it, and obviously access is much preferred that way as well. Focus on getting control over all your important information silos, not just the system that you're going to be using on a regular basis, but think beyond that. Think beyond just the content you're going to store within a system. What information do you have within your organization that you need to get control of? Because it is possible to apply retention, records management capabilities to documents that are outside of these systems if the primary way that they're being accessed is through your content-centric solutions. That includes file sync and share. You need to tackle that challenge. While file sync and share certainly has some very key capabilities that end users rely upon in terms of being able to share information very quickly, that's an area where you really do want to make sure you have some visibility into the content that is being stored on that, and make sure that if there's information that is being stored on file sync and share that you need to be able to apply retention to, consider pulling that information, importing that information on a regular basis into your content repository so that you can apply the full level of controls that you might need. An important thing that we haven't talked about yet, but that we'll talk a little bit more about here in the next 5 or 10 minutes, is around classifying your information, making sure you understand what your documents represent, and that's going to give you the information, the insight you need to be able to understand what type of retention and records management you need to apply to it. Because ultimately what you want to do is apply some level of automation to that. You want to make it so that automatically documents that you know need to be retained have retention policies associated with it. If you know a document is a record, lock that information down, apply good retention to it so that you can guarantee that that information is going to remain protected. The more you can automate on that, the better the stronger your policy is going to be, and also you're going to avoid missing documents that you really should have retained originally. Let's talk about some of the tools that I think are really important to making this possible. So one of them is certainly artificial intelligence and machine learning. We see a lot of focus on this as a way of automating classification. But the reality is there's no easy button. We can't just press a button and get classification. There are different technologies that we need to be able to use, and there are also different applications and use cases that leverage that. So being able to do everything from content extraction when you're capturing scan documents, being able to get information in that way. Maybe you have forms that you're capturing, you're extracting all the data from those forms. That's certainly one way to get some classification information. But we also see artificial intelligence being used increasingly to be able to infer what documents need to be classified as part of this process. And I think there's a real important point here. Improving on the situation makes it better today. Good enough is better than today. And the second thing here is that, if you train your system, validate it, and use it over time, you're going to get real business value out of that system. Don't let perfect be the enemy of good. There really is an opportunity here to dramatically improve things. Maybe not get it perfect, but certainly reduce the amount of information that you need to classify manually to a much less extent, much smaller percentage than you're using today. Now, if we look at artificial intelligence, we actually find that there's two different kinds of AI. There is generic AI, and these are tools that are available today from a number of different vendors that have the ability to extract key information, apply tagging to information to be able to again, infer what information is important, how it needs to be managed. But what we increasingly find is that if you apply business-specific artificial intelligence, you can get highly relevant results, and you can actually customize those models to deliver extremely meaningful outcomes for the business. Let's talk a little bit about what's available here. So the first option is certainly available in many public cloud services here. We see them from Google and Amazon, Microsoft, and so forth. But there's really key information here. You can train the model very well. You can leverage their commodity services pretty easily. You can use these by themselves, or you can stack it with some other technologies. But there is some real value here. But beware the law of large numbers here. The fact that you're leveraging these generic services means you're going to get somewhat generic results, and you're not always going to get exactly what you need that's relevant for your business. So that's the way we think that's the way we think is most effective, is using AI that is specific to your business. It's specifically crafted for you, and it's been trained on your documents, the types of information that you're using. We think an AI system needs to have tools that aren't just built for machine learning experts. You really need to have tools that can be trained by your everyday users potentially, or especially business analysts that are helping to define the documents and be able to execute on it. And you need to make sure ultimately that you understand why it's doing what it's doing. You need to make sure that the training model provides enough documentation, enough reference in there to be able to understand exactly what it's doing, so that it can be audited, and so you can understand when it maybe makes a mistake and misclassifies something, why that's happening, and why you might need to go back in and do some additional training. Nuxio Insight certainly powers that through the artificial intelligence that we're providing. It can be rapidly assembled. You can have very simple configuration controls that really just require you to train the document and tell them what you're looking for. We have templates. We have reusable components. You can leverage other software libraries to be able to add additional capabilities to the system, and you can configure it to work exactly the way you want without having to make any kind of complex customizations. The low-code capabilities we have in Insight really do make it very quick and easy to deploy. And I think the other thing I said, don't let the perfect be the enemy of good. This is why. So, think about like a user situation here. They may be very accurate, maybe up to 90% or even higher in terms of their accuracy of classifying information. But the reality is, and this is true with ECM solutions, across the board, is that we often see that the tools that we put in place to help end users to validate or to participate in a content services application are very difficult. They're cumbersome. They require really mundane manual tasks, and so as a result, adoption becomes very low. And what ends up happening then is that 90% accuracy, which looked great, if it's only being adopted 50% of the time, it's going to yield results that are more like 45%. Whereas machine learning delivers, we see certainly results upwards of 90% and even higher. But even if you take a low number like 60%, that 60% is going to apply 100% of the time. So you're maintaining that level of accuracy, even if the accuracy of the decisions isn't quite as insightful as your end users might be. So this really does help, and what it does is reduces the strain on end users such that you might actually be able to raise that adoption number as a result. As I said, perfection is not necessarily the standard here. If you're leveraging AI, if you're doing automatic classification, if you're applying good retention rules based on that information, that's going to be seen as a positive by courts. Courts don't demand perfection. They require reasonable, good faith efforts, and this certainly qualifies for that, especially if you layer these capabilities together. If you're applying different artificial intelligence, different classification capabilities, and having some backup from end users, you can certainly get there. And then what follows, what you can use to follow then, is applying good retention management to documents based on that intelligence, that new insight that you gain through artificial intelligence. One of the things that we have asked users is, kind of what do you do with your documents when you're done with them? And you can see here that 18%, almost 20%, no procedures, another 40%, strictly relying upon manual user actions to be able to delete documents. So that's like 60% of the documents that you really don't have very effective control over getting rid of. And what that results then is you're managing more and more and more and more information, much of which isn't necessarily necessary to retain. So being able to set up some automated retention really does offer some great benefits to the users here. You can take incoming information through a combination of artificial intelligence, automated classification, maybe some backup from manual users. You can identify what information needs to be recorded, be noted as a record, and how you want to apply retention controls to that. So you can do it in a much more automated way. And what you find then is that the retention policies then kind of dictate the way the system behaves. So users who have the ability to delete documents will not be able to delete a document that has retention policies associated with it. The other thing you can do is have workflows that are watching that retention policy, so that after that retention policy is expired, you can define what you want to do with it. Do you want to leave it as is, just maintain it in the system? Many organizations do that. It's not necessarily always the greatest idea, but there are some good reasons for doing it. Many others actually archive that information, move it to lower cost storage, keep it around in case we need to find it after the retention policy or retention period ends. But maybe it doesn't need to be as accessible as immediately as it would be during the retention period. And ultimately, many organizations just delete that information. They see liability in actually maintaining information beyond the retention period, and they've actually deleted that content. And so certainly, depending upon the use case, depending upon the government requirements that you may have around those documents, you may want to make decisions based on that. But certainly, you can very easily establish workflows that allow you to deal with all of these eventualities. Ultimately, you want to enable very secure records management. You want to make sure that you have secure access to those important records, so that as information is identified as a record, you still can apply access controls around that. But keep in mind, those access controls for a record are maybe not going to let you make any further changes to this document without making it a separate document. Or it may not allow you to delete that document, obviously, because you have retention policy associated with it. Because you're applying those automated declarations, you can find great productivity increases with your users. Your users are no longer having to worry about identifying certain documents or individually assigning each one of those to have a retention policy. That can be done automatically for a very large percentage of the documents that are coming into your organization. The cloud certainly is going to provide you ubiquitous access to that information. So again, based on security controls, you can get to the information that you have rights to very quickly and easily through management in the cloud. And ultimately, you can automate actions both during and especially after the retention period so that you're dealing with the content in a secure and appropriate way given the governance requirements that you have for the information. So how do you get there? How do you modernize your information? How can you connect and consolidate all this information together in a new system, especially when you've had significant investment in that system over many years? So I think the first thing is certainly here to connect your new content services platform to your existing storage platforms that you have. And that includes legacy enterprise content management systems that perhaps you have been using and don't necessarily want to completely replace on day one. So you can integrate those different repositories. It provides you a way of being able to get up and running very quickly with a new approach without having to completely reinvent every wheel that you've ever invented over the past several decades. Ultimately, as a long-term project or as a phase 2 or 3, you may want to consolidate your systems and be able to start to consolidate much of the information from legacy systems into the new system of record. But like I said, in the meantime, you can federate this information in a way where your new content services platform becomes the front door, but you have the ability to access rooms that may represent legacy systems. And ultimately, your focus here is really unlocking value from your content. You want to be able to optimize business processes, certainly automating a lot of that through artificial intelligence. Being able to get more information from a document allows you to optimize those business processes. Retention policies and records management are certainly important aspects of that and can be driven from those new insights. But there's a lot more you can do with it. You can find out, what accounts this is relevant to. Changes for a product might have implications in many other different systems that are leveraging that one part that you're discovered some new insight around. So being able to discover those new insights from information can be quite enabling for an organization. Good governance, security, records management, retention, all remain incredibly important and are certainly part of content services platforms. It's important to be able to maintain some level of security for information. But ultimately, you want to also be able to accelerate your journey to the cloud. And I think that's certainly one of the key benefits of new content services platforms is their ability to access that content in the cloud. So I hope this was valuable. At this point, I certainly want to open it up and see if there's any questions that have come in from our attendees. And we'll certainly see if we can help answer some of the questions you might have.